Hello, Peter Carson here with Extranet User Manager, and welcome to our webinar today on unstructured versus structured extranets in Office 365. A quick intro for those of you who haven't been on one of my webinars before. My name, as I mentioned, is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, located up in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, on a nice sunny day in June. Also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. As always, we'll be posting a copy of the slide deck up onto the event page for this webinar, as well as a recording that should go up there in the next day or so once we get the recording processed. So all my contact details will be in there, and you'll be good to go from there. For those of you that are not familiar with Extranet User Manager, quick history, it goes back quite a few years. It began as a product that Envision IT created for a number of its clients, and then a few years back we actually morphed it out and created its own brand around Extranet User Manager. We've launched out Azure B2B support in 2016. It really didn't hit its stride though until version 4 came out and the Graph API for Microsoft sort of evolved around B2B. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. We'll talk more about what that means, business to business support, and how we can provide external sharing in a broader, more structured way. Quick overview of some of our clients. We've got clients across North America, Europe, a little bit in Australia, Asia as well, so well spread out globally, about 85 customers using the product and growing every week from there. If you didn't see the announcements, we had a great interview a couple weeks back now when Logan, my sales manager, and myself were down at the SharePoint Conference 2019 in Las Vegas, met with Mark Cashman and Stephen Rice, who are part of the product team with Microsoft on the SharePoint side, and really had a great chat with them, which led to this webinar, actually, just talking about external sharing out of the box, some of the interesting things that they announced at SharePoint Conference, and then how we complement and build on that from a larger, more formal, structured extranet style. So if you haven't caught that, feel free to grab the link off our deck when we post that up. It is an article up on our site, and we've got the full video interview in there. It's about 8-9 minutes long, so not too long a listen. So a quick agenda, what we're going to go through here today. We're going to start by talking about unstructured extranets, more ad hoc style and leveraging out of the box, and some of the interesting new announcements that came out of SharePoint Conference a few weeks back. Then we'll switch gears and say, okay, well, beyond the unstructured, more ad hoc, what about when you get into structured extranets, leveraging things like Azure business to business? How do we lay Extranet User Manager on top of that, and in particular, how do we use that with Office 365? And we're going to do a number of demos. We're actually going to demo a new users SharePoint framework web part that we've developed, some flow connectors and such that wire all that together very nicely from a great Office 365 solution point of view. Before we get into that though, I just want to do a quick poll. So let me just open this up. So if you could take a minute, just let us know, do you currently use any or all of the above? Feel free to select more than one through there. Office 365, Microsoft Flow from a workflow point of view, Power BI, and SharePoint on-premises. So we'll give you a minute to respond to that. All right, let me close that out. Just share that quickly back so everybody can have a look at what that looks like. So about 3/4 of people using both Office 365 and SharePoint on-premises. I guess there's some crossover. Some may be only using one or the other through there, but pretty high penetration on both sides there. About half of folks using Microsoft Flow and likewise Power BI. We're not going to touch on the Power BI on this session. It is something that we provide a Power BI connector for our Extranet User Manager product. We should really do an upcoming webinar on that. But we are going to talk a fair bit about Microsoft Flow and custom connectors that we've created, both for some Azure automation for site creation, as well as interfacing in with our Extranet User Manager product. All right. So moving along, let's talk about unstructured extranets and Office 365 external sharing. So, I mean, this is a feature that's been in the product for quite a number of years now. It's evolved, and each year at Ignite, at SharePoint Conference, there's new features that come out as part of that, and we're going to talk about some of those new and interesting ones there. It really supports very well ad hoc collaboration. If you've got documents that you want to share with maybe a few dozen external people, honestly, you don't need our product. Use what's out of the box. It works really well from that point of view. You have a number of different options there around how you can create secure links to share to sites, to libraries, to individual documents, to folders. They can be shared to anybody who has the link, so it's an anonymous style, where if you have that URL, you're able to either access or even edit documents. You can choose whether people have edit rights there or not. Whether that's just people within your organization or people with existing access, or you can actually name specific people and ensure that only those people can come in and access through there. So you've got a fair degree of security options in terms of what you can provide. And as administrators, you can actually configure, how security sharing is going to be enabled, not just from a tenant point of view, but from an individual site collection point of view as well. You can log it down entirely and say, you know what, for these sites, or maybe for the tenant as a whole, we just don't want to do the external sharing. Or there's particular sites that it makes sense to turn that on and allow certain types of sharing. But again, you can say, well, you know what, this site you can only share with specific people, whereas this one here, you're fine to do the anyone link and do the anonymous style sharing. And this sharing applies not just to SharePoint, but also to OneDrive as well. So OneDrive being your personal space, private by default in Office 365, but you can share that out either with members of your organization or with people externally, depending on how the rights have been set up by your administrator. And then the same applies to SharePoint sites themselves. So let's talk actually about some of the new interesting things that came out at SharePoint Conference 2019. And the first one, I actually really like this one. This is an interesting concept where rather than wanting to share files out with externals, you actually want to collect files from external people. So how do you do that? Well, you create a link to request files from them. And the idea is that anybody who gets that link has the ability to upload files into that folder. Now it's private, so you may send that same link out to 20 different people. Let's say you're doing a tender process for requests for proposals and you want vendors to be able to securely submit their tender documents into that folder. Well, each vendor obviously should only see their own documents. So they all get the same link, but they can then upload files in there. They only see their own content, but you as the organizer then see the content from all of those folks through there. So lots of different ways that can be used. It's a great way to collect information from externals. Other scenario I see it quite often is, dealing with organizations where we have very large files. Email attachments really don't work well from that point of view. Maybe it's an engineering firm and they've got CAD files, or it's a creative design agency and they've got video files or large graphics files. Sending those by email just doesn't work well. Rather than firing up Dropbox or doing some alternative sort of shadow IT, this is a great way to solve that particular scenario. I haven't seen details yet on how this gets locked down. Can you turn on just the request files and not the other sharing options? Because this is still net new. We haven't actually seen it yet in our tenant, but very keen to see where that's going. The other thing, Microsoft Teams, if you're not familiar with Microsoft Teams, we're going to be showing it today. It's a very hot product as part of the Office 365 family, and more collaborative work is moving into Teams and away from things like Skype for Business and Outlook, going away from email focus to persistent chat, which is a big thing within Microsoft Teams. So if you're working in Teams, what happens is when you work with documents, those documents don't actually go into Teams, they go into SharePoint under the hood. There's a very rich integration between the different products in Office 365. You've got these documents that ultimately are in SharePoint under the hood. Well, what if you want to share those documents with external people? Well, rather than having to go to SharePoint, right within Teams itself, and not just the Teams app, but the Teams web and the mobile applications all allow you to do this, to select a document, a folder, share those out, and have the same rights, the same administrative controls apply as in SharePoint as they do in Teams. So as people get comfortable with this style of sharing links out, it's important to be able to do that in all the different ways that you're collaborating. You see it in the other Office documents as well. If you're running a modern version of Outlook and you go to your recently used documents and say, I want to send this document, Outlook actually encourages you to actually share the link to that and set up the permissions on that as part of that. So again, making it very seamless for people rather than to do email attachments, which is how historically a lot of people share documents, moving that more to a link in a central repository, which is just such a better process. If you think about people emailing document attachments around to a large group and then edits and modifications happening, and suddenly you've got umpteen different versions that you've got to consolidate back into one, all that goes away if you say, well, everybody just works against a single version of the truth that lives in SharePoint. The next thing that we're actually quite keen on is the integration with Azure AD business to business. The idea that you can leverage more of the Azure AD features right within the external sharing features itself. One of the key ones is this idea of a one-time passcode. And this has been a big pain point for external users trying to come in with either the sharing or the B2B in the past, where if you didn't have a Microsoft account or if you weren't using Office 365, it was not a friction-free process to create your account, set your password, get into the site that somebody was trying to share with you. And Microsoft recognized that. So last year, they announced this idea of one-time passcode, and they're growing on that. The idea is if that user doesn't have a Microsoft account, then they just get literally, as it's called, a one-time passcode email to them. They enter that code in, and they're into the site from there. So it's a very friction-free way of getting into the site. Also recently announced with Azure AD B2B is Google Federation. So if, say, I'm interacting with somebody who's on Google Docs and uses Gmail within their organization, they can actually sign into Office 365 using their Google credentials. I know it sounds crazy, but the organizations are working together, and this is great to see that I can be working on a competitive collaboration platform and use those credentials to come into Office 365 and collaborate with an organization that is using Office 365. And we're actually going to show some of those features with one-time passcode. You can leverage additional premium features in Azure AD if you want to as well, things like conditional access that says, okay, there's going to be different rules depending on what content you're coming into, things like should we apply multi-factor authentication, which means I have to not only sign in with my credentials, but I have to register a device like a smartphone and get a text message or an authenticator application to prove that I actually have those credentials. So it can get fairly sophisticated in terms of what your security requirements are there. Next one is around sharing reports. So just, who's sharing what? As you open the doors, if you leave them wide open, there is going to be a lot of sharing going on, and that can get a little bit out of control. So how do you put some management around that and some structure around that? Well, you can actually pull down CSV files from OneDrive SharePoint Online, telling you everything about who's sharing what, where, when do those links expire, all that kind of stuff comes down through there. Now, they don't have pretty reports as part of that just now, but if you're an Excel wizard or Power BI wizard, it's actually really easy to create graphics like what we have here that show us a nice visual view of what that looks like. And having the raw data is handy because then you can manipulate it and turn it into whatever you want from there. I mentioned in the previous slide about expiring. This is another thing as well, to say, well, you know what, just because I've invited somebody in to this site, to this folder, to this document, doesn't mean that they should have forever access to that. In fact, they probably shouldn't. So let's have some policies that can define, when do people lose access to that content. And the IT administrators can define that at the organizational level, but then the site owners, the administrators, can extend that as required. So, maybe that's defaulted by your organization to 60 days. You've shared something with somebody, it's approaching that 60-day mark. Users are going to lose access to that. They're still working with you. You can then extend that out from there. You can just keep extending it if you need to, but it's a proactive thing. You actually have to explicitly say, yes, this person is still involved, still needs access, and I've now extended their access. So if you forget about it and 60 days goes by, that person loses their access. And if they're not supposed to have access anymore, you don't actually need to do anything. So that's the default behavior, and that's really what you want, is secure by default and then extend it as required. We put together an article on our site that talks about all these sharing announcements. So in addition to having them in the PowerPoint deck here, I encourage you to go to the URL there to the resources articles, external sharing announcements. It's got all the latest and greatest from that point of view. There was lots more that Stephen Rice from Microsoft presented during his session at SharePoint conference, really going over all the different options and such from an unstructured sharing point of view. We've only got an hour here to go over a lot of content, so I'm not going to dive more into that. I wanted to highlight some of the key new things that came out as part of that. So switching gears now, talking about structured extranets. What is a structured extranet? I think of it as a more formal extranet where you're bringing large numbers of external users in. You may have hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of external users that you need to interact with. And going to a share link dialog and typing in 1,000 email addresses of people that you want to share that with really isn't practical. So how do you build on that and provide a more structured process to that? Well, Azure Business to Business, as a feature of Azure AD, is a way to do that. It provides a rich hierarchy and structure around those external users. You're basically inviting those partners into your Azure AD. Now they get guest accounts; they're not getting full accounts, so it's not like you're creating an account and a license for them. And the idea is, as a partner comes in and uses that, if they're already using Azure AD themselves, it's very seamless for them because they actually use their same credentials. They can be signed into their Office 365, connect through a link to your Office 365 to what you've shared with them, and boom, they're in. They don't need to sign in again. It's very seamless from that point of view. And as I mentioned, the one-time passcode and the Google Federation helps for those people that aren't using Office 365 that don't have Azure AD credentials. At the end of the day, those are, full objects within your Azure AD. You can apply permissions to them. You can make them members of groups. You can do all the same things you do with any other Azure AD user through there. So it is very secure from that point of view. And the other nice thing is that because those partners are using their Azure AD to come in, or they're authenticating through a one-time passcode to an email that's associated to that Azure AD. If they leave that organization, if they lose access to that email, they no longer have access to your site. So as people leave your partner organization, you don't need to worry about, well, I need to take them out of our extranet because they have a username and password in there. All that goes away. It's taken care of seamlessly for you. So they don't need to have their Azure AD, although it does work very well for those that do. So that's just on the Azure AD side. What does that mean in Office 365? Well, the key is from a SharePoint Online point of view and a OneDrive as well, partners can be granted access to any part of your SharePoint Online. You can make them a site collection administrator if you want to. Probably not something you want to do with your external users, but it could make sense in certain scenarios. They are considered external users by Microsoft, and there is some legal language around what an external user is that you need to abide by. If this is a subsidiary or an acquired company, those aren't external users. They should be licensed unless they're already licensed through that subsidiary or partner organization already. But the idea is that they satisfy that criteria as an external user, they don't need any Office 365 subscription. You could, in an extreme case, have a single Office 365 license and share that with hundreds or thousands of external users. It needs to be reasonable. Those needs to be people that are outside of your organization, but the scenario exists from that point of view. And rather than applying permissions directly to those users in Azure AD, you can put them in groups in Azure AD, and then you can apply permissions to that in SharePoint Online. We're going to talk about that. That's a key feature that we leverage in Extranet User Manager. And the idea is that the site owners can then manage those Azure AD groups. Now, if you're using native out of the box, they do need to go to the Azure portal to do that. You can delegate so they only have access to their group. It's a little onerous. I'll show you the Azure portal in a minute to take you through that. No fault to Microsoft, but it's really built as an IT pro tool. It's not an end user, business user type of tool. And that's really what we provide with Extranet User Manager, is both a simplified interface and some enhanced functionality specific to this external sharing scenario. So let's talk about the different experiences as you invite somebody in through Azure AD B2B. Whether you've got our product or not, this applies to both scenarios. So if that person you're inviting in, as I mentioned, is on Office 365 or they have Azure AD credentials, that's the simplest. They just log in with those credentials. In fact, if they have a browser open, already logged into their own Office 365, it's seamless. They don't need to see another sign in. They're just right into your portal from there. So that's a very ideal experience. Now, if they're using a business email that's not set up in Azure AD, that's where the one-time passcode comes in. So in that case, that passcode is sent to their email each time they log in. The code's valid for half an hour, and they input that 8-digit code. You basically copy it from your email, paste it in the login form, away you go. And we're going to go through that login flow. If they're using consumer email, like a Gmail or a Hotmail, I mentioned, the direct federation to Google is now supported. If they're using Hotmail, that's owned by Microsoft. If you have any type of consumer Microsoft account, that's also supported as part of that as well. So trying to create an optimal experience regardless of which of these three scenarios that you're going in. There's some nuances there that we're still figuring out with Microsoft that I'd like to see more details on. Like if I've got an external party that does have Azure AD set up for their organization, but it's not fully implemented and that particular external user doesn't have access or doesn't have credentials, that in the past has been a challenge. And can we force that person to use one-time passcode? Not today, but that's something we're asking Microsoft about to say, hey, there's still a couple of use case scenarios in there that you haven't thought about that we need to tweak a little bit from that point of view. Okay, so that's been talking about the out-of-the-box experience. Why would you then leverage Extranet User Manager on top of that? What in addition does that provide to you? Well, we've got a number of different features that come as part of our Office 365 features with Extranet User Manager. The first is that, as I mentioned, that external sharing is really not scalable. As you get into large numbers of external users, it becomes a bit of a mess and governance tends to go out the window. So you need something that's more structured and more scalable from that point of view. Azure AD B2B is that, but it's not particularly end user friendly. Going into the Azure portal can be a little overwhelming. Delegation can be a challenge there as well. There is no self-registration, there's no integration to line of business systems, no integration to on-premises AD, which, there's some scenarios where that makes sense as well. So Extranet User Manager addresses those. It says, hey, we can provide self-registration, profile management, delegation, private registration links, all sorts of features there that just make it easier both for the owners that want to share the content and for the external users that want to come in. We manage the invitation process. Azure AD still manages the login process, but permissions, group management, all happens in the product there as well. So if you want to think about, when should I use one versus the other? When should I use external sharing? When should I consider purchasing Extranet User Manager and using that on top of Azure B2B? Well, as I mentioned before, if you've got a few people, a few dozen people, it doesn't make sense cost-wise to deploy Extranet User Manager. We'll talk about the licensing costs later. It's not horribly expensive, but if you're only sharing with 6 people, you do the math, it does start to get expensive from that point of view. If you just got a couple of individual documents, you need to do some co-authoring on it. You're the sole administrator, maybe you're sharing it from your OneDrive. It is a great alternative to Shadow IT, so I do encourage not locking it down entirely and making it available to people in the right scenarios. Say, hey, as opposed to people getting out their credit card and doing alternate ways that we really don't have the governance and control over what's happening with that sharing, let's keep it inside Office 365 and use the out-of-the-box external sharing. But as you get more people, you need granular permission sets, you need some self-service functionalities, as I mentioned, like the self-registration, the private registration, my profile, those are features that we provide there as part of that. And I'll show you in a minute as we get into the demo how the delegation model works. It's very easy for the business owners to manage their sites and the people that are coming into those sites. And we tie very nicely in with site provisioning. This is something that's really important in Office 365, not just for SharePoint, but for Teams as well, to ensure that sprawl doesn't happen. We have our own open source solution that I'm going to be showing here today. You can use it with others, like Valo Teamwork is a great third-party product that we integrate with. We've done a webinar with them to show how Extranet User Manager fits in with their Teamwork product. So there's lots of scenarios from that point of view. So let's quickly go through some of the features in Extranet User Manager, and then we'll go into live demo from there. So the first one I'm quite proud of, still not fully baked, it hasn't been released yet, we're working on it for an end of June release, is our new Groups and Users SharePoint Framework Web Part. You'll see more of this as we go into the demo, but the idea is that you can embed this right in your SharePoint Online site, even in Microsoft Teams, and actually manage the users, invite in new users, approve registered users right through the SharePoint site, right through the Teams interface. And those users are going into groups. Permissions can be all wired up in the background automatically. We can use things like our Flow connectors to do that. And I'll show you Microsoft Flow and how that fits in together as well. It'll have full awareness of what user is signed in and what permissions they have. Does the current user just a member of the group and they should see other members so they can contact them? Is it an owner of the group that should be able to add new users in there? Is it a group creator who can create new groups? All those scenarios, the UI will tailor and morph depending on what rights the logged in user currently has. In fact, if you don't belong to the group, you can have multiple groups on one site. I'll show you that. You may not want Group 1 to see Group 2's members because it may be a competitive situation, a vendor situation, things like that. So it's very flexible in terms of the security around that, and it leverages the security that's in place on the core product itself. And we'll show how those fit together. We've got the administration components that allow us to manage both users and groups and all the system settings as well. So you can still come to the management console, but all of the group membership management you can actually do through that web part that's in Teams or in SharePoint Online. It's a fully branded experience. You don't want to get Extranet user manager branding everywhere through there. We allow you to take that over entirely. We've got a nice ability to create nice login forms. That doesn't actually apply in the Office 365 scenario because Microsoft controls the login experience, but I will show you some branding that we do even on the Microsoft login form. But all the emails, all the pages that the end users see are fully brandable through there. This delegation idea that I've mentioned is very important to the product. The idea is that IT really doesn't want to manage the external users that business knows about. They just become a blocker in that whole process. So the business gets annoyed at IT, and IT has extra work that they really don't want to be doing. So have the ability to delegate that out to the business owners themselves. Let them manage the external users securely. They don't get to manage the permissions if you set things up properly, but they can decide who's in what groups and invite people in through there. They might not know who all those external users are, so the ability to have a fully customizable registration experience that can be very tailored to your needs in terms of what fields you want to capture and how that workflow is going to work. We have things like flow integration, so when somebody registers, you can actually trigger off a flow workflow, direct it to the appropriate people from there, make different decisions to say, hey, where does this need to go, depending on information that's entered in, and get quite sophisticated from that point of view. We do support SharePoint on-premises. We're focused today on Office 365, but if you're running anything from SharePoint 2010 to 2019, we support all of those as well. It's not a heavy install. It doesn't actually go on the SharePoint server. Basically, just a little bit of PowerShell that you run on the server to say, hey, trust Extranet User Manager as an identity provider, and away you go through there. Likewise, in Office 365, there's some things you need to set up in Azure AD to allow that trust so that we can create groups and create users in the Azure AD as guests through there. It's fully adaptive design, so whether you're working with the end user pages or the admin console, that all works on a smartphone, tablet, desktop. We use Bootstrap as the underlying framework to make that very responsive and easy to use. We don't host the software for you, so you manage and control your own environment. You can deploy that onto your own servers, or you can load it up into Azure. Azure is really our preference here. It installs as an app service, so a lot of the management actually gets done by Microsoft, but the nice thing is that you control that whole environment. All right, so let's dive into a demo from here. We're going to go through a number of different scenarios. So let me open up a browser here, and we're actually going to start here at a landing page in our Office 365 tenant. And the intent of this page is it's kind of dual purpose. It's intended to be used by business owners that want to come and see what sites they have access to, but actually request new sites. And it's also used for external users to come in and figure out what sites they have access to. Now, you may not want to blend those two together in a production scenario, but in the demo scenario, it actually works well to have those two tied together right there. Right now, the site is fairly empty. I've just got a couple of dry run sites that I've created through here. What I'd like to do is take you through first the site request process and explain why that's important and how that functions. So the idea is you can have self-service site requests turned on in your Office 365 tenant, and not just in SharePoint, but in Teams, in Streams, in Planner. That actually creates a bit of a challenge for IT administrators, because if everybody's creating all these different entities in Office 365, you end up with this sprawl, and you get multiple teams or multiple project sites for the same project because people didn't know that somebody else already created it. So you really want to get in front of that and have some sort of funnel that everything goes through to say, hey, this is the spot to request a new site, to request a new team, to do anything from that point of view. And as I mentioned, we've open sourced a lot of this. The SharePoint framework web that I'm showing here is not part of the open source, but everything else that I'm showing you with the PowerShell scripts and the flow integration is all part of that as well. So what we've got is this site request SharePoint framework web part here. And it's quite flexible to structure. I can come in and I can create multiple divisions within my organization that allow people to choose from. And you can put security trimming on that to say, hey, only certain people within my organization see certain divisions. So you can actually control at the department level if that makes sense. And then you can have different templates available to different divisions. They can be shared across multiple divisions. It's all set up through lists in SharePoint. So you don't need to do any code or any changes to the web part to do this. You actually just configure a number of different SharePoint lists, and that wires it all together from there. So let's say we want to do a modern team site. So you saw the form actually morphed and changed there when I chose that, and you can define what fields you want to capture here as part of the site request. And again, you don't need to change the HTML. You literally just go in and change the content type for this particular site request, and this web part is smart enough to dynamically create the form on the fly. So there's a couple more fields that you want to capture, just add them to the content type in SharePoint, and the web part will display them, capture them, and away they go from there. Doesn't matter what type of fields they are, it supports the full set of SharePoint fields. So whether it's a text field, a number field, a choice, a lookup, a managed metadata, all that's supported through there. So let's go ahead and create a title for this. Now, because I've chosen a modern team site, I'm not going to give it a URL. I'm actually going to give it an alias, because what's going to happen underneath the hood is this is actually creating a Office 365 group for me. So it's going to have not just the SharePoint site, but a number of other entities created as part of that as well. I've defaulted it to say we want this to be a public group, which means those groups are discoverable by anybody within the organization. They can request to join that group. And I've also turned on the Teams integration. So the scripts have been updated recently, so we can actually provision the Teams side of it as well, and it'll create the Microsoft team associated with this site. So let's go ahead and submit that. So what it's done is it's posted that request into this sites list, and we have a flow workflow running against that. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So if I come over to my flows, here's our site request flow. Let's actually talk through what needs to happen with that flow. We can see that it's actually running right now. And one of the first things it does is it checks to see, hey, is that site one that needs to be created? Yes. Well, before we actually create it, we want to start and wait for an approval. So I need to go over to my approvals. I've got an email notification that just came through. So if I look here, here's my site request for that Webinar 611 site that I just created. I can approve it here. I can approve it through Flow. I have the Flow app on my phone. It pops up on there. I can do the approvals there, enter in any sort of comments that I want to have on that and confirm that. Let's go back and look at that flow and just follow it along as it goes through its process. So it's still running. It's been running for about a minute now. I love this view in Flow where you can actually watch a workflow in process and you can see what's happening with it. So we can see that the approval has a green checkbox on it, so it has been approved and it's moving along to the next step from there. So that's a condition to say, hey, was it approved? If it was no, then just send a rejection email to the person. We did go down the yes path through here. And this is using what's called Azure automation. So it's calling out to some PowerShell scripts that are hosted up in Azure to actually do the provisioning of that site. And we're not going to get into the depths of the PowerShell, but let me just show you the runbook and how that's running. So if I look at my Create Site runbook here, we can see that it's actually actively running because the flow is called out to that, and away it goes. This is a great way to tie together, flow from a zero code point of view, but then when you need to get into code to do the nitty gritty of creating the site, we're actually using the patterns and practices scripts from Microsoft, so it's some open source scripts to go through that process. And if I look quickly at the PowerShell itself, it's going into that list to say, hey, what just got entered in the list that I need to create. And it's going through a bunch of paths to say, hey, am I creating a modern team site, communication site, a classic site, what have you from there. And it's got a bunch of P&P script to go through and create those sites. So we open source all this script, so that's all available to you. You can use that as you see fit from there. I haven't updated the white paper that goes with this, but I do keep the GitHub up to date, so it's got all the latest scripts in there. So it takes a couple minutes to run through there, and then we'll see that job is run through. While we're waiting for that to go, I'm going to come back to the landing home. I had a couple of sites that I'd pre-staged up here, and there's two different flavors that I want to take us through here. The webinar demo one here was actually created with the Envision IT client site template. So this is a little bit different template than the out-of-the-box modern team site. It's based on the modern team site. But the difference is that we've applied a patterns and practices template to it. So what you can do is you can create a site the way you'd like to create all of your sites, and then you can capture that as a template. It creates an XML file, and when you create new sites, you can use that template to define how that site should look. If we look on the left here, in addition to the usual shared documents, we also have a private documents library. We've got a little bit of metadata like document type and document date that we've added to the standard documents that are in there. And we've got the same thing in private documents. Now the idea is, the way we work at Envision IT is we create one of these client sites for each of our clients that we're working with. First thing happens even before the deal is signed. Often the client site is created as we're going through the proposal stage and preparing quotes and presentations and things like that. They're all going into the client site. And then as we're working on the project, often we want to then engage the client in that site. Now, there's always going to be some things as a vendor that we want to keep private to ourselves. And that's why we've got the private and the shared documents. So when we share the site out, we want to share everything except the private documents. Now, I mentioned governance and structure. The way that Extranet User Manager really helps with this is through this web part that we have here. So the web part itself is our Extranet User Manager Groups and Users web part. It's baked into this template, so when I create a client site, I have that there. And in fact, this particular template actually creates an external readers group as part of it as well. So it's all set up and ready to go. Now, I've done some tests here, so I've already got some accounts set up in here. But normally when I come into a new site, this would be empty. I wouldn't have any users in there. So let's actually go through that process of creating a user. So I'm just going to use the same format that I've got there. This is kind of an open mailbox that we can use from a testing point of view. So what's happening is the SharePoint Framework web part is actually calling out to our Extranet User Manager product. So we have a full API for everything that you can do in EUM, adding users, editing users, creating groups, configuring the product. There's endpoints for all of that. In fact, I'm going to show you how we can use that from a flow point of view as well to manage that. So we've got a new user that just got invited in through there. Now, one of the tricky things with the new users, there's certain spots I want them to come into Office 365 that I want all my external users to have access to. Microsoft made a change, I guess about 6-12 months ago, where they took away the everyone group. So you can't grant rights to Office 365 to everybody, including external users. There is an everyone except external users. So our challenge is, well, we need that external user group. So we can actually use Flow to do that. So if I come back to my Flow, actually the other site is created. We'll swing back to that later, so that one's done. I'm going to bring up another flow here, which is this add new users EUM. So what we're doing is we're actually triggering off of a new user being created in Extranet User Manager. So our product can be both a trigger in Flow as well as an action that can be done through there. So if I look at this particular flow and what it's doing, it's saying, okay, hey, when a new user is created in Extranet User Manager, we want to call it to the API and add that user to this group. Now I've put in the group key here to keep it simple. I could have actually used Flow to query EUM by name to get the key, but I thought I'd keep the flow simpler. So if we come over to our administration product here for a second, let's just search up groups here. This all B2B users, that's the group that I want to put people into. And we see up here, its key is 31. In fact, if I come down in my members, we can see that test 611-4, that's the user that I just created, is already in this group. So that flow is already fired through and added that user to the group. That'll become important in a second when we talk about how that user then comes into the site. So let's have a look at that. I'm going to come over to my email, and I've got a new email that just came in here. Let me pull this across onto the other screen. Welcome to that user. Oh, sorry, it was 611.5. I think it was on the next page there. This email is completely configurable. You can go into the console here and say, hey, I want to configure that particular email. Let's just choose the Azure B2B invitation, which is that one there. I've got a rich text editor in here. I can go right into the HTML source and define exactly what I want that email to look like. Apply all my branding, everything from that perspective. But the key is this link here that says, hey, you've been invited in and you can come to this site where you can access the extranet. Now that site is not actually the site that I invited the user into. What this site is a landing spot that everybody can go to that'll then direct them to the right sites from there. So let me just copy that link. And what I want to do is open up an incognito window so I can be that external user. So I can go to that link. Imagine I just clicked on the link from my email. And of course, I'm not signed in, so I'm going to get the Microsoft login form coming up. Now you can see here we've applied our Extranet user branding to the Microsoft login form. That's something you can do in Azure AD, so you can apply your own company branding to this sign-in if you want. So it still feels like you're coming into your Extranet. Let's come back here. I'm just going to grab that email address. So we can edit users, we can remove users, we can do all sorts of functionality through here. We'll explore that a little bit more in a minute. So I'm going to sign in with that email address. Now that's not an Azure AD email account. So we're actually seeing a one-time passcode functionality here. So it's just sent a code to that email address. Just give it a second. There's our account verification code. So this email came from Microsoft. There is, I believe, a little bit of tailoring that you can do on this one, but basically what I want to do is take that verification code, paste it in here, and go ahead and sign in. I have to consent because this is the first time I'm signing in. I won't see this in subsequent times. And I now get access. So now it's going to take me to that site/landing URL. Right there, we see that. But there's a sites list web part. I'm going to show you a bit more on that. It flashed by because it said, you know what? This particular user that just signed in only has access to this one site webinar demo. So I'm not going to give them the choice because there's only a choice of one. I'm just going to take them right through to that site. So this is important because you can give all of your users, you know, this URL here. In fact, you could post it publicly on your website if you were comfortable sharing it out more broadly. And we do have a self-registration that can be part of that as well. And everybody can come through that, and it will then direct them through into the appropriate site from there. So if I look at, sorry, too many windows going on here. Come back to my landing site for a minute here. Now, in this case, I actually have 3 sites available to me, including the one that I just created through the site request form, so it pauses and holds for me. If this list got fairly long and I got more than, say, 10 sites in there, it actually turns into an AZ web part to make it easy to navigate through hundreds of sites, if that may be the case through there. So it's a very flexible web part. It kind of tailors itself depending on the user that's coming in and how that works. So I mentioned that all B2B users group is important from a permissions point of view. And the reason for that is that we've given read access to this site to anybody that belongs to that group. So it's important to get all external users added to that so that they can get to this site and they can see their view of it. Now this list itself, if I look down into the list items itself, and I look at this particular one here, and let me just check out the permissions on this list. We're actually just using out-of-the-box functionality to make all this hang together and work. So this list item for the webinar demo that we've just gone through has unique permissions on it that's granted to that group that's associated to the site. So basically, if you have access to the site because you're in that group, you're going to have access to the list, and the list is going to show up just the sites that you have access to. So we didn't have to build a whole bunch of functionality. We're actually leveraging things out of the box from Microsoft to make that all hang together and work from there. Now, right now, I'm in as the external user. I'm still seeing the groups web part. We haven't completed the security trimming on it yet, so I still see the ability to create new groups and add users. You know, typically as a member through here, I wouldn't be able to do that. Now we also have this option of pending members in here as well. So let me show you a bit how that works. So let's say you're not sure entirely who all those external users are that you want to bring in, but there's somebody within the organization on the external side that does know that. There's 2 ways you can do that. One is you could actually make them a group owner, and they would be able to add users through this web part themselves, and that's a valid scenario in certain scenarios. The other, though, is to say, well, hey, I just want to get a registration link. So we can copy this link, and it allows the user to register and show up as a pending member. So the owner will get an email to say, hey, there's a new pending member in here. You can use this to then approve or reject those users coming into your group. If we look at the group itself, in fact, I can come over here to the edit group. It'll launch me out into the full administration interface, we can see there's actually a lot of different parameters that we can set on the groups. We don't expose them in the web part because you don't really need them at that point there. But we have the idea of both a display name and an internal group name. We include the name of the site as part of the internal group name just so we can keep them organized and together. I could deactivate a group to say, hey, I want to shut this group down. And down in here, we've got this available for registration option. And this registration URL, that's the same URL that I got from the web part. Now I have the option to make that either publicly available or make it just private. If it's private, somebody has to have the link to be able to do it. If it's publicly available, if they come to the self-registration page, it'll actually appear in a drop-down list and anybody can choose that. You could turn off approval on that, and when somebody chooses that publicly available link, they're just immediately in the group, and they can come into the site. So you can make it as open or as selective in terms of approvals as you require through there. We've got the concept of owners. So when a group gets created, the owner is set to the owner of the site. We actually need a little bit of more integration to get that piece functioning in there. And we can see all the members, including that test 611.5 member that we just added through there. Any requests that were pending would show through here, although we show them on the web part as well. So you can choose to either work through this interface here or to stay right in SharePoint Online and work with the web part there. So let's come back now to our main landing site. Let's have a look at that site that got created. So remember I went through the site request process and I created a webinar 611 was the site that I was creating. So let's have a look at that site that got created. So this is just an out-of-the-box site. Nothing's been applied through there. If I wanted to put that web part in there, it's actually very easy. I can just come in here and say, okay, I want to edit this. And let's say I want to add a new web part up here in column 2. Expand that. We can see down here is our groups web part. In fact, there's our site request form and the site list web part. They're all SharePoint Framework web parts. So I can choose that. I don't need to do any configuration. It already knows what site it's in and it wires itself up from there. So I go ahead and republish that. Boom, I've got that in there and I can create a group through here. Now I mentioned Microsoft Teams. So let's actually switch to Teams now. So if I come over here to my Teams interface, remember I set the checkbox to yes to say I wanted to create a team as part of that group that I was creating. So here we see the webinar 611. That's the site that we just created. In fact, if I go to my Files tab and I say, hey, I want to view that in SharePoint, it's going to be taking me to the exact same thing because all the files in Teams are actually stored in SharePoint. But let's say I want to actually interact with the users. I can actually do the same thing I just did on the SharePoint page. I can come in here and add a tab, and we see, excuse me, here's our same groups web part. It's the same part. We didn't create two versions. We had to tweak it a little bit to make it work with Teams, but I can then install that onto my team. It takes a few seconds to wire itself into Teams. And again, I don't need to configure anything on it. It already knows the team that it's associated with and what the underlying site is from there. So I don't need to change any of the settings there. We'll wait a second to render. And there's our same group there. So right in Microsoft Teams, I can say, hey, I want to create a new group. Now, we built a bit of a scenario here to say, hey, if you're creating groups in Teams, the external sharing scenario here is, well, maybe you've got multiple groups on one project that you want to share with. And we see this often with architectural or consulting engineering firms. They're working with a lot of different subcontractors on a single project. They don't know who all those parties are when they start the project. So let's make it easy for them to add new groups and define it from there. So I'm just going to keep this simple and call this channel 1. We'll make it a read group. Go ahead and submit that. What this is going to do under the hood is we have another flow workflow that fires off from here as well. So let me come over to my flows. And we have an group creation. So this is triggered when a new group gets created. And basically what it does, it also calls out to some Azure automation to create the Teams channel. We could almost do it all within Flow, but there was a few pieces missing from the Teams integration that we couldn't quite wire that together. So we said, okay, let's just take it to PowerShell, pass over all the parameters that we need from the group that just got created, like what site is it for, what's its display name and its role name. And what the Azure automation is going to do is actually create a channel in Teams for that. Now, I just changed some of this stuff before part of the webinar, so I'm not sure if this is going to hang together for us or not. It's still running through there. But what should happen when that's all finished is we should see a new team show up, or sorry, a new channel show up in this team. And it's got its own files area. It creates a separate spot for documents to go into in a folder. And part of that provisioning can set the permissions to say, hey, that group that we just created, this channel 1 group, is going to have read permissions, because I chose read, to that folder that just got created in the SharePoint site. So a lot of moving pieces between Teams and Extranet User Manager and SharePoint, but it's a nice way of tying it all together and saying, okay, let's do this in a very standardized, predictive way so that our business owners don't have to think about how they're going to configure this for each scenario that comes along. It's done in a very repeatable way for them. All they need to do is say, hey, I want to create a new group. Boom, it's done. The channel gets created. The permissions get set. They don't need to touch anything. They just start inviting people in from there. So a nice way of managing that. And all the functionality that we saw on the SharePoint side, the ability to add, edit, remove, get the registration link, edit the group itself, is all available through the Teams web part as well. Let's see if that finished through. No, that's still running. We can go back to our slides and we'll just wrap up from there and then wrap up the webinar as a whole. Okay. So I mentioned at the beginning, from a licensing point of view, if you've only got half a dozen users, it probably doesn't make sense to use our product because of the costs around that. I mean, we do have a light version that's up to 250 users, but if you only had 6 users in there, that would be costing you, $40 odd per user per month. That's a little hefty. But as you get into larger numbers of users, we get a standard edition that takes you right up to 5,000 external users, and an enterprise edition for above 5,000 users. So we kept away from the model of charging for each external user that you invite in. We wanted to make it fairly open and just have some buckets there to say, okay, you don't have to think about, each user, should I invite them or not, because I'm going to start paying for them. Choose the bucket and go from there, and they're pretty broad buckets from that point of view. All our pricing is in US dollars. Full pricing details are up on our website there. So we explain exactly feature set and any differences from that point of view. In terms of what I've been showing you today, there are no differences functionality-wise between Light, Standard, Enterprise. They can all do everything that I've shown you through here. Before we go to upcoming events, I just want to go back here. Okay, that did complete through. Okay, let's have a look at what got created there. We can see here we've got now one hidden channel in here. I can open that up. There's our channel 1. So that just got created, and this files tab is now going to be secured to that group that we just created. What that means is any files that I put in here, that channel 1 group is going to have visibility to. They won't be able to modify them because if it was read-only, I could have made it contribute and they would have been able to upload files into there as well. So those external users can interact with that. We're not making them full Teams users, so this Teams is still private to our organization, but the files themselves can be shared out from there. Last slide here, actually meant to update this. We've got one more thing to go on here. So we're going to be down at Inspire. If you're a Microsoft partner or a Microsoft employee, love to connect up with you down there. Logan's going to be in Las Vegas for that, July 14th to 18th. We're putting together another topic for July 23rd for our next webinar. If there's specific things you'd like to dive into, hear more about, maybe it's the site provisioning or the Flow custom connectors, we can certainly go deeper on those topics. Let us know. In between the last two, we actually have Christian Buckley, who's a fellow MVP working with us. He's going to be presenting at SharePoint Fest in Seattle at the end of August, a session on external sharing. So he's going to be covering a lot of the topics that I covered in the beginning session part, and a little bit on the structured as part of that as well. And then we'll be down at Microsoft Ignite at the end of November, or beginning of November in Orlando, Florida, for the big annual conference, all things technical from Microsoft's point of view. So we're a couple minutes ahead of schedule, which is always good. Never want to run over from that point of view. I want to respect people's schedule. Logan or Amanda, I don't know if there was questions that were asked during the session that we want to deal with through here, or whether those were all answered as we were going through. Awesome. So from there, I want to say thank you to everybody for attending. Hope you learned something new. And if you've got questions, it doesn't have to be about Extranet User Manager. It could be about scenarios just from a out-of-the-box external sharing point of view. We're happy to help you from that perspective. We've got lots of experience on both sides of the fence there. So thanks very much. Have a great rest of your day.